Now, this next part of the presentation of the day is kind of weird for me because I'm going to give a presentation. And normally when you MC a day like this, a summit, the person that's MCing wouldn't typically give a presentation. But I like breaking the rules, so. More so than that is that this is such an important issue to me personally. And as passionate as I am about helping women who have had abortions, I'm growing in that same passion to make sure that we care for our loved ones. And so today I want to share with you a little bit about the Embrace the Journey curriculum that we created at Anglicans for Life. Say a little bit about who we are and give you a little commercial kind of thing. So I'm going to go ahead and do that. And Anglicans for Life. So you all know who we are now. And I am honored to be the president of the organization. I started in 1998 as the executive director. And I remember agreeing to do this for 2 years, but no more, because this was just not going to be my gig. But anyhow, want to just share with you our mission statement, which is that we are the only global ministry that seeks to educate, equip, and engage the church in addressing life issues and addressing Scripture's mandate that says that we should protect the vulnerable, care for the elderly, defend the fatherless, and plead for the widow. It's based on Isaiah 1:17. But most of all, it's that we recognize that throughout Scripture, life is sacred. There is no place where we don't see God telling us that we shouldn't be protecting life, and it's made in His image. And that's what we firmly believe at Anglicans for Life. All of our materials are always biblically based, and we want everything to reflect God's glory and to bring Him glory through everything that we do. So that's our mission statement. And we create resources oftentimes to help fulfill that mission statement, especially when it comes to education. And specifically, when it was back in 2008, I started looking around at all the pro-life organizations, and I started thinking about how do we educate the church really, and what are people doing? And I just so happened I had come across a Lifeway curriculum, an adult ed series. And I thought to myself, why aren't we doing any adult ed programs on the sanctity of life? And I started thinking, well, there's got to be a program out there. So I did, I checked it all out. I looked around. Lutherans for Life has written a number of programs, but they're kind of standalone programs. They have one big picture, all life issue curriculum, but it tends to be geared to more of the youth. So Anglicans for Life set out to create a curriculum for adult education. And so we started Project Life, and it's an 8-week program, and it addresses all of the life issues. And a lot of churches used it in their adult ed series and in their adult ed Christian formation classes. And we really strongly encourage you to consider using it because it does address everything from the gospel of life versus the culture of death is the first week. We get into adoption, abortion, post-abortion, abstinence, euthanasia and assisted suicide, cloning, bioethic issues, stem cell research, that sort of thing. And then the last week we set up what can the church do? So that was a great plan, and just last year we actually rewrote it and updated all the information in it and created a second version for Canada because we have a strong presence growing in Canada thanks to Reverend Vicki Hedelius and her great team and Bishop Master's help as well. So we've now created a new version of Project Life and a Canadian version. And so that was great. And once I had a template on how to create a curriculum, I decided, as my parents turned 80 years old, that it was really important that I understood the end-of-life issues because I was going to have to personally walk with them through that. And I wanted more than anything to make sure that I honored their lives as much as they loved me and honored me. So, before we finish, I'm going to get ahead of myself. Go back one, please, Allie. On this slide are a couple of other things, and one of them is the catalog that is in your green bags, and it has information about all our resources and how you can order all of our publications. And one of my favorites is the What Can You Do to Protect Life? We've actually started a website with that, whatcanyoudotoprotectlife.com? .org? .com. And it will allow you to go in there, and we'll always be putting up fresh ideas and new things that you can do on what can you do to protect life. The other thing that we have created is the Quasar Conference. And that is a half-day conference that I come out to your church and I actually present 1 hour on abortion issues, 1 hour on end-of-life issues, and then the last hour we talk about what your church can specifically do. And we are happy to come out and do that for your church or for your diocese. And in fact, I had the opportunity to go down to what's your area called, Ward? Northern Neck, and I presented it down at your church, and it was great to do. And so you can ask Ward and Judy if they liked it. So those are just some of the materials and resources that we have. You did it, oh, okay. All right, well, I'll get you back. So anyhow, well, let's move on from there. So I was telling you about creating Embrace the Journey. My mom and dad turned 80 years old, and I started thinking I need to really be prepared. And so it took me a while to really pull all the pieces together and to make sure I understood the issues. And I remember when I started out to write this, I thought, we're going to write about euthanasia and assisted suicide. And when you start laying out 8 weeks on euthanasia and assisted suicide, you quickly realize you can't do 8 weeks on those two topics. It's way too much, and it was a little overwhelming. And I started, step back, look at it again, and I realized we needed to, as a church, make sure that we were really thinking about aging and dying, and whether or not, as a church, we were helping people age well and die with grace, because it's part of living. And I was facing it in a fresh way with my parents growing older. And so we expanded the vision for the curriculum to really helping equip people my age to prepare for their parents and help the church prepare for this growing demographic. Allie, do you want to go ahead and change the slide? The demographic, as it reads right now, is that there are 40 million people in the United States over the age of 65, with 5.5 million of them over the age of 85. The fastest growing demographic are us aging folks. Everybody ages. The baby boomers are getting older. And so if you're not the baby boomer and you're the kid to the baby boomer, you're going to have to be taking care of that situation as well. We need to, as the church, recognize that if we're not addressing death, the culture will, and they are. And so personally, and both, as well as recognizing the needs of the church, it became apparent to me that we needed to do something. And we wrote Embrace the Journey. And now I'm going to tell you the hard part. I finished Embrace the Journey on my mom's birthday. 24 days later, she had a stroke and never came out of it. And she died. And I'll tell you, I was the first student because I was able to survive it. My mom and I were really, really close, and it was a really difficult death. But I understood everything that was happening. I had put my hands into all the places that I had feared what would happen when one of my parents would die. God graciously prepared me through this program. So I'll tell you, I'm the first student of it, and it worked. I'm still standing. So Okay, I want to quickly go through with you the different weeks and what we teach in each week, because I really commend the teaching to you. So week 1, we address mortal life versus eternal life. As I said, we need to acknowledge the reality of aging and the fear of death. And so we do that. And I'm so grateful that so many of the specialists, not only the specialists about the issues of euthanasia, but the spiritual specialists that were willing to share their experiences. A lot of our bishops, a lot of our priests were interviewed for this series, and they speak to their experiences, and so their voices are included. So that's week 1, and then week 2, we actually got into euthanasia and assisted suicide, and we talk about the definitions and the history of it, and we help educate people in that class, if you will, and I'll let them understand all the elements that you guys have gotten to understand this afternoon. And let me just kind of digress for a second and say we create a leader's guide so that the leaders have something to literally walk them step by step through, and then every participant gets their own book as well. And it's really helpful information. There's a DVD for each week that goes with it, so that all the leader has to do is just kind of facilitate the class. And that's really important because these are difficult issues. And so it's nice that you don't have to be an expert in the issues. The information speaks for itself, and it is very well presented. And we've had a lot of positive feedback about how it's created conversations where they needed to start. It's healed people of hurt. We have a lot of great testimonies on it. So week 2 is where we got into all of this stuff about euthanasia and assisted suicide. And then in week 3, what we did is we moved on to talk about the more subtle methods of hastening death. Some of the things that we've also had touched on today, like dehydration, terminal sedation, as Joe talked about, futile care. But we also got into organ donation and what that looks like and what that means for a family. We talk about infant and child euthanasia and how children that are being born with any kind of ailment that will be life-threatening, where doctors now recommend to the families to simply comfort the baby and let them die. And we have testimonies of people that have had to walk through that kind of experience and how they were misguided by the doctors in their situations and how they found help in other ways. And so we even recognize the struggles that families deal with at the beginning of life with their infants. In week 4, we get into the end-of-life healthcare issues, which is where we talk about hospice. But we also have Rita Marker that talks about healthcare and the issue of rationing and the role of Medicaid and the things that you need to know related to how those things are used and how they are going to potentially be used with the new healthcare act that we had in often referred to as Obamacare. We talk a little bit about a palliative care and how people understand that, and comfort care. And then we talk about the warning signs of compromised care. And that's very important. In week 5, we talk about the advanced directives. And as Joe said, living wills are very, very bad. And a lot of folks in the 80s were encouraged to write them up. And living wills are a problem because they are open to interpretation by somebody who might not be your personal physician. It was funny, Dr. Allen and I were talking about this a couple of days ago. We all assume that our physicians, who we know well and oftentimes have very similar worldviews of ours, and have almost a Marcus Welby for those of us older folks that know who Marcus Welby is, there's a sense that they're going to take care of you and they're going to be by your bedside if you're in the hospital. But in today's healthcare setting, they're not. And so you write the living will thinking of Marcus Welby, but when you're in the hospital, you're ending up with the reality of a doctor you don't know. And it was funny because when I was starting to do the research and work on this, and I was reading some stuff, and I kept thinking, this is a little far-fetched. This really can't be happening. And I happened to be in California with my folks, and my dad started feeling really bad and was close to passing out, and my mom said, you really need to take him to the emergency room. I'd rather, you're here still, go with him and see what's going on. And so I took my dad to the emergency room, and they thought he might be having a heart attack. They weren't sure. They ran him through a bunch of tests, and so they finally decided they were going to admit him. And it's now about 1 o'clock in the morning, and they advised that they're going to admit my dad. And so we're in the ER with all the different beds. And my dad said, well, go on home, I'll be fine. And I said, no, Dad, I'm going to stay with you until you get up to your room. I just want to make sure you're okay. And so we were laying there and talking, and his blood pressure would shoot up, and then it would calm back down again. And, we weren't talking, and his blood pressure would go up and come back down. And so about 4 o'clock in the morning, the admitting doctor came in to see my dad. Hi, Mr. Nutting, so glad that you're here, and, we're a little concerned about you and your care, and we need to admit you, but we noticed that you don't have a DNR order in your medical chart. And I said to the doctor, I said, excuse me, sir, we don't know for sure what's going on with my dad. Why would you be concerned about a DNR order right now? And he said, well, the hospital wants a DNR order for all patients, especially if there's a potential heart issue. And then he looked at my father and he said, because, sir, you don't want to be a vegetable if you have a major heart attack. You don't want to be left on a ventilator and in some situation where you're existing. Your quality of care is very important. And so we want to know that we should, do not resuscitate order if you have another heart attack. And I said, excuse me, sir, the last time I checked, my father will never become a piece of asparagus, a carrot, or a tomato. And my dad looked at me and he just kind of started laughing. And the doctor looked at me and then he looked at my dad again and he said, Mr. Nutting, we would like for you to sign a DNR order because we're concerned that if you have a heart attack, your quality of life would be compromised. And you could tell that I had now irritated the doctor. And so I interrupted again and I said, sir, as I said, my dad will never be a vegetable. And we are not signing a DNR order tonight. I said, if you want to talk about it tomorrow, that's something we can talk about. But it's not going to be discussed at 4 o'clock in the morning under this circumstance. And the doctor looked at my dad again and said, Mr. Nutting. And my dad started laughing and he said, she's just like her mom. You really just need to listen. We're not going to even talk about this anymore. But I was dumbfounded. And I was frightened at a whole nother level. Because had I not been there, he would have talked my dad into signing that order. Because what I've learned is that as they're older and they're scared, they're very vulnerable to suggestion. They're very vulnerable to being talked into things. And it's really important that advance directives be discussed in the family in advance of needing them. And they have to be a durable power of attorney for health care. And Joe referred to that person as your agent. I like to refer to that person as your advocate, because that is ultimately what they're going to end up doing. They're going to advocate for the patient when the patient can't do it themselves. And it's really important to recognize that everybody needs to have a durable power of attorney over the age of 18. Because nowadays, if you have children over the age of 18 and they're in an accident or something, The doctors, especially if, and this is going to sound terrible, but if there's a brain injury and an opportunity to harvest body parts, organ donation, that child, that young person, is not seen as your son or daughter. They're seen as the potential savior to a lot of other people. So declaring them brain dead quickly is an important move, and unless you have legal documentation, the hospital can choose to ignore your wishes. It's really important to think about and to have your young people sign those things. My daughter was 20 when I put one in front of her, and she wasn't sure what I was up to, but she trusted that Mom knew what she was doing. So anyhow, advanced directives is a huge issue, and we address it in Embrace the Journey, and I really encourage everyone to think through what you are currently using. And we recommend the durable power of attorney that you can order through the Patients' Rights Council, because they are very carefully written based on the state that you live in. And if you move to another state, double check and make the changes, because not all power of attorneys will travel with you. If you move from Pennsylvania to Florida, they have different laws, so you have to be thinking about those things. Moving on, in week 6, we got into practical planning. What are the things that we need to think about when we're aging in terms of first honoring our parents? By the way, do you ever notice that it's the only commandment with a caveat? Stop and think about it. Honor your mother and father so that it will go well with you. I mean, that was like, gosh, there's an incentive. I thought, well, maybe it just had to, God recognized that as we modeled it, then our children would do the same for us. I'm not sure, I'm trusting in that. But anyway, practical needs are a big issue. Everything from recognizing that decision-making as people age becomes harder. They might choose to do something one day and the next day change their mind simply because they saw a commercial. You need to appreciate that as we're dealing with our aging loved ones, understanding how their minds subtly change helps us to recognize the changes that we have to help them begin to prepare for and make and adjust to, whether or not it's time to retire. My parents were 84 years old and they were still working, and we had to have a sit-down discussion about, like, do y'all have plans to retire at some point? It was bad, but we had to do that. And talking about finances, having somebody that understands all those details, all these things, where are wills? Have they been updated? All these things need to be addressed and kept current, because we don't live in the world that we lived in 25 years ago. And the circumstances have changed, and the way that these things are looked at are changing rapidly. The other thing that I was shocked with when I wrote this and did the research was the level of elderly abuse. And being able to, as people, begin to look out for that for one another, and members of our church, where we might see bruises and wonder what's going on, or, that their money is quickly dwindling and what's going on. They are very vulnerable, and being able to recognize that abuse can come in many forms, and how we can be sensitive to it and wise about it is very important. And then this was a really hard thing to do, but we added what the last stages of dying looked like in the practical week, because it was important to help us understand when you were really at that final stage versus you've got weeks or months to go. So we included that information. In week 7, we talk about funeral planning. And I was amazed at how many choices there are when it comes to funeral planning. And you just, and being able to walk into a funeral home and start to look at those things for yourself, for your parents. Those are all issues that we tend to be a little frightened of until we have to do it, and then we, are kind of forced into it. But being able to do this advanced planning, thinking about it, I can't believe the difference between people's opinions on cremation versus burial. And what was really funny is when my husband and I started talking about this, he was shocked that I was adamant about being buried, and I wasn't surprised, but he definitely wants to be cremated. And I kind of thought we would both be buried. So, having these conversations are important. All of this stuff was really helpful, and people being able to walk through and think about, what are your plans? Do you want a church service? Do you want a burial service? Thinking about all those things are helpful. And then finally, in week 8, we asked, what is the church's role? We suggest practical ministry ideas. What can the church do for the aging and dying in their community? Running support groups, there's a list of different things that can be done, and we talk about those things. Then we got into the issue of suffering. And John Rogers does a great teaching about the importance of honoring suffering and how difficult it is, but how we walk with one another through it. Acknowledging the fear of death. Folks, there are a lot of people, even Christians, who think they're going to heaven, but there's still this kind of fear that maybe they're not sure. I was surprised as I've moved around and talked to people about these things and gotten into discussions. Folks that you would have assumed were assured of their place in heaven questioned whether they really were. And so we have to, as a church, help people have that assurance. It's the perfect opportunity for evangelism all over again. So I really commend Embrace the Journey to you all, but there's a bonus. There you go. One of the funny things that happened as I went around and I interviewed people and I talked to people, they all gave me these little booklets of, to fill out, like the insurance guy. Well, we recommend that everybody fills out this booklet that has an inventory of their assets. And the funeral director handed me a booklet of all the things that they wanted people to fill out in advance for the obituary and, questions. And the church had forms to fill out for church service, for the funeral. And I got another one from an attorney about, what the will should look like. And so I had all these things sitting in a pile in the corner one day. And I thought, there's so much repetition in that information. Nobody fills out those forms because there's repetition in it. Ta-da! What we did is we took all the information they were asking for and we collected it and put it into one document that you fill out. Now, it's called Finishing Life God's Way, and it says by, and it has your name because you write this book. And this has all of your information or whoever is going through the program's information. You can buy these individually as well from us so that every member in your family can have their own. Everybody should. Every adult should have one of these filled out. And it's filled with information. And it also contains things like a list of your passwords, because we talked to one widow who said that her and her husband had worked through all kinds of stuff because he was very ill and they knew he was going to die. But the one thing they never thought about were passwords. And their entire accounting and banking and everything was on a computer. It took her months to get into the system over passwords. So we put in a page about passwords. So everything that all of those booklets on the floor in my office asked you about, we gave you as to be able to collect in one book. And then the trick is that you tell somebody where the book is. Our daughter's godmother is 90 years old, and she has a best friend who's 83, and a sister who's 80. And these three women have been just a huge blessing in our lives. And none of them have children. None of them are ever married. And as I worked on this, I thought of them. And it just so happened about a year earlier, they had come to me and said, they asked me if I would be the executors of their estates. And I said, yeah. And then when I finished this, I went back to them and I said, on one condition, that you fill out these papers and that we talk about what you really want as you're aging and as you get into the issues that we're going to get into. And my dedication to them now is that I'm not just going to take care of their money afterwards, but I'm going to take care of them before. And they're members of our church. And I'm there for them. I go see them every Sunday. I do their medications. I check in with them all the time. Folks, there are thousands of people in our parishes just like them. And as they get older, they need more and more help. One final thing I want to note in reference to this whole issue is that we don't have the answers yet on all the ethical issues related to how do we care for the elderly and how do we end life graciously. But we're working towards it, and I'm so grateful for Dr. Allen and Todd as they, and we raise up, God is raising up people in the church to help us establish ethics and guidelines for helping understand how far to take medical care and when to not embrace it or not go to it. What Anglicans for Life has done is we've come up with a simple statement. We want to do everything we can to make life quality and as it can be, but we don't want to artificially keep people alive out of fear of death, nor do we want to artificially hasten death. We want people to die naturally in God's timing. Now, in order for that to happen in today's culture that is growing with support for dying, the polls, we see growing support in this country for assisted suicide year by year. In order to be able to stop that, we have to, go to the next slide. We have to take this quote to heart. This quote is from Dr. Bernard Nathanson, and he said it after he became a Christian and was accepted into the Catholic Church. Dr. Bernard Nathanson was one of the architects of how we legalized abortion in this country. He worked with Larry Laderly and the feminists to turn the right to abortion into a plank in the women's movement, the feminist movement. And he was a huge proponent of abortion in New York and getting it legalized. And he later became a Christian. And he said, we would never have gotten away with what we did. They did a lot of lying. If the church had been united, purposeful, and strong. Folks, those words haunt me. Because I know God's people can be united, purposeful, and strong. We were caught off guard in the 60s and 70s with what happened with abortion and how it got legalized. We aren't going to be caught off guard with euthanasia and assisted suicide. We can't be. So, thank you. Go ahead to the last one.